Not only is there the issue of the fact of workers not having jobs or now having to trade off their skilled jobs that kept them in close confines with their families now to larger cities where they feel much more isolated. This is called urbanization. There's really not much in the way of city planning, and that's sort of a consequence of capitalism, demand and supply. If there wasn't demand for apartments or demand for housing to begin with, they're not going to be there when individuals move in. And by the time these workers are coming in and they're living in slums and the city needs now some sort of infrastructure, it's going to be pretty hastily built, and probably not really sufficient to the needs of the population. Those searching for work in the cities have very little in the way of resources, and they tend to find themselves in urban slums, small, cramped dwellings with little ventilation or sanitation. Meanwhile, the growing upper and middle classes can move to better areas, or in fact turn lower classes down to certain areas. So you're going to have the development of cities in different areas of the city. Very difficult to improve their way of life. One of the selections you're going to be reading this week, Samuel Smiles' Self-Help and Thrift, very much displays typical attitudes of those who have been able to work their way up from nothing. Now, Smiles does definitely have a point, and yet he does miss the overwhelming problem of urbanization and of the plight of the working classes. That someone is always going to have to be at the bottom. That's the only way this sort of system is going to work. Many of the jobs that are required for industrialization are low skill, dangerous, and disgusting. And there are very little regulations in terms of working conditions or labor laws. So, in order to support yourself, you have to take what you can get. And occasionally, you might have gifted individuals who might be able to work their way up into management or at least into foreman, something a little bit better. But not everyone can be a manager, not everyone can be a foreman. Someone is going to have to be doing the dirty work. There's a great deal of resentment against the upper classes, particularly because the working classes have not benefited from liberal revolutions or liberalism. They don't have voting rights, so workers have no ability to influence government or to have any true, real political representation. And this is going to take the form of many reform movements and some small revolutions against government. The Chartist movement in Britain during the 1830s is a sort of loosely joined group of related working groups who want political reforms. They wanted suffrage, they wanted secret ballots. Ballots were generally actually cast in public and be very easy for someone to be influenced or for a recorder to pretend that he misheard who exactly was voting for who. And they wanted a little bit more reform for MPs. The fact that you would get paid if you ran, the fact that there didn't have to be property requirements, and this would enable individuals from the working classes to be able to run for office. Now, some reforms of the Chartist movement are actually going to make it through to Parliament, but the movement for the most part tends to disappear. Very similar to the 1848 revolutions, which are crushed by ruling parties. There's definitely an incentive for more conservative governments not to extend too many voting rights to the people because they're worried about a revolution on the scale of the French Revolution happening again. So they'll give way on certain little items, but for the most part, you don't see major reforms in society. And we're going to be looking in the next few chapters about how governments could actually get away with that. Now, when these sort of disparate unions or these movements don't really get going, it really begins to separate, and individual trades or individual labor groups begin looking after themselves. And this is the emergence of trade unions and socialism. Now, the unions emerge as a way of battling unfair working conditions. The unions emerged generally as an informal organization amongst the specific trades. And the unions would perform services that would then help try and foster the community, so trying to help battle a great deal of the isolation that workers found themselves in. Dues for unions could cover stipends for injured workers, widows and orphans, and they would also handle negotiations with managers for better working conditions. Labor strikes with the early unions were quite frequently violent affairs, as owners and managers could actually call in the police saying, "We have this group of," and of course, if you struck, odds are you were going to be fired, and say, "These people are disruptive, they're damaging our business, we need protection." And so they would call in police to protect their businesses from what they would term unruly rabble. There was a huge amount of risk in actually joining a labor union and deciding, yes, we are going to go on strike, because you could actually become blackballed, which means a list would circulate with individuals who had maybe socialist ties, who belonged to unions, and who were deemed disruptive workers. And this list would circulate to a lot of the major hiring centers. And so all the owners would know, okay, this person, you don't want to hire them unless you want to be facing a strike. And so this individual, although he was driven to trying to make a better life for himself and try to improve his working conditions, now won't be able to get any work at all. Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle portrays Norwegian, I believe, immigrants who come to Chicago in hopes of a better life. And it's a incredibly vivid and visceral novel because it really shows you the seedy underbelly of industrial life and then a lot of the common issues faced by immigrants. Unsanitary conditions of the meatpacking plants, low wages with rising expenses, resentment of your job and living conditions, alcoholism, dabbling with backdoor politics, socialism, death, and child labor, discrimination, social and cultural barriers. And these are all definitely characteristic of the working classes of many immigrants. It also tends to depend on your particular ethnicity of these immigrants, depending on exactly where they are going to find themselves in society. German, Irish immigrants do actually face a great deal of persecution by what we like to say, or what those individuals try to deem themselves as true Americans. Americans who have been there for 2, 3, 4 generations and don't really want to see a lot of foreign upstarts coming into their country. It's very interesting when you're looking at this at the United States, which is probably one of the very youngest Western nations in the world. There are certain groups like the German and the Irish who are actually able to get into specific niches. Sort of the caricature of the Irish police officer in Chicago or New York or places like that. It's not so much a caricature as that was definitely a staple of that life, a staple. In Germany, what's going to become future auto workers, a lot of fine craftsmen are going to be coming to the United States and will find their niche there. But they are very much still separated. In the West, when it comes to building the railroads, there's going to be a massive influx of Chinese immigrants because they are cheap labor and because they see an American opportunity that is not available to them in China. And yet they're also going to be facing a great deal of persecution by a country that does not really want them and yet wants their cheap labor.